life history, a little bit about how beavers populations have changed over time, some of the benefits that beavers provide for ecosystems and for people, and then some of the challenges that we have when they're on the landscape, and then some final thoughts. Okay, so let's start at the macro scale. So this is the culprit, Castor canadensis, the North American beaver. There is a European beaver, Castor fiber, and they're ubiquitous on the landscape, or at least they used to be. So they cover a lot of ground. These are pretty big rodents. It's North America's largest rodent, so up to 4 feet long, including the tail. They're really big, and they're like kind of flat and wide. So when you see them on land, you're like, whoa, that's a big animal. Average size, 25 to 70 pounds, but there has been some anecdotal reports of trappers. One trapper reported a 125-pound beaver in Canada. So that is a huge, huge animal. And so the reason we're talking about these guys is because they modify their environment pretty substantially. And people don't really think about what the landscape may have looked like prior to European civilization and kind of all the changes that we made on the landscape. But prior to widespread trapping and reduction in populations, beavers were pretty much in all small streams across North America, as long as their habitat requirements are food, so woody vegetation, and perennial water flow. And beyond that, they can be anywhere where that's present. So they can be up in the Arctic, they can be in the desert, they could be everywhere in between. So they were likely in all small streams, and they were likely building dams up those streams and accumulating huge amounts of sediment, so changing the morphology of the stream basins, and also storing just unbelievable amounts of water. So what the landscape looked like prior to Europeans getting here probably looks very different than what it looks like right now. So before people started trapping out beaver, they started in like the middle 1500s, but really kind of kicked it into gear about a century or a little bit more later. But estimates are that there was around 400 million beaver before European trapping. So that's a lot of beaver on the landscape. There was a pretty healthy fur trade going on in Europe, and the fashion was these beaver fur hats. And once the populations in Europe were trapped down to really small numbers, it was kind of coincided with people realizing that there was a huge beaver population in North America, and it really kicked off with Hudson Bay Company, and then it just expanded out. So people began trapping in the Northeast and radiated out, and as they did so, they pretty much reduced populations substantially across most of North America. So by the early 1900s, we estimate that populations went from 400 million down to about 9 million. So substantial decrease. You may have heard a wives' tale that during that time, there were no beaver in the contiguous United States, so we had to bring beaver from Canada. I don't know if I've heard that. I don't know if you guys have. That's probably false. People stopped trapping when it was no longer economically beneficial to do so. Once population numbers got down to low enough number that trapping would require a substantial effort, people just moved on to different areas. So there were small pockets of beavers throughout these areas, but they were just in very small numbers. So after beaver populations were removed, they often, trappers or people coming in after trappers would often break the dams out, drain the wetland system. And then after it dried out, it created awesome farmland, super rich soils, all that sediment that I was mentioning, really fantastic, rich soil. And so many of these areas turned into farmsteads, potential industry, and then more recently, some of those areas, or many of those areas, turned into housing developments and other infrastructure that really relies on flat ground. So we've really encroached into beaver habitat pretty substantially. So just fast forwarding a little bit. As people have moved into those systems, those beaver populations were still in low numbers, but beavers make more beavers, and so the population started to increase, and we started to see local, state, and federal agencies going through and systematically kind of maintaining streams by removing beavers, either removing the dams continuously or removing the dams and trapping. So Army Corps of Engineers did a lot of that work for to maintain navigability. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USDA, Canadian Department of Agriculture, other state agencies would literally just walk all streams and remove beavers. So it was really like a maintenance of these populations. So then,
You say trapping, does that always mean like trapping and rehoming, or does that mean trapping and killing?
oh, this is the 100% trapping and killing.
Okay.
Yeah, and so those agencies have largely stopped doing that, but APHIS, which is a USDA agency, they're responsible for nuisance wildlife throughout the United States, and they still do a surprising amount of beaver removal. I don't remember what the number is, but it's tens of thousands, if not more than that per year. So they're very actively managing beaver populations in certain areas, but it's usually for direct conflict, and often it's in relation to agricultural issues. All right, before I move on, so as people and agencies began to trap less, the fur market really kind of dissipated. There used to be a pretty active trapping industry where people would trap beavers and sell the furs. The trapping and fur industry is pretty much gone. And then there used to be kind of recreational trappers, people that just enjoyed trapping beaver and other wildlife for just the heck of it. All of those things have pretty much kind of dried up. And so populations have started to slowly rebound, and pretty much as one of these population control mechanisms would go away, populations would start increasing, and then the next one would kind of go away, and we would see greater and greater rates of repopulation. So we're currently in a state where we're seeing populations rebounding pretty much everywhere you look. So in natural areas, in the urban interface, in suburban areas, we're seeing beavers kind of popping up all over the place. And this is not just in Massachusetts, this is here, this is in the South, this is in the West, this is the Midwest. It's pretty much everywhere it's happening. Did I see a hand over there? Yeah.
What would you generally say is the lifespan?
What's that?
What is the lifespan of it?
I'm going to get to that in 1 second. Yes. Thank you. All right. So we turn, is there a light switch here that we can you guys see it okay? The way it is?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. A little video, which is kind of cool, watching a beaver cutting a tree down here. Hopefully this works. Okay. All right, so here's a wildlife camera video of a beaver cutting down a tree. This guy started probably a couple days ago. They can cut down a tree in 1 day if they want to, but they generally have other stuff to do, busy beavers. So they're building lodges, they're foraging, they're caring for their young, and they're cutting trees down. So this guy makes quick work of it. They can get squished when they're cutting trees down, that they generally get out of the way when they do it. So this is the beginning of the potential benefits and problems that you might find. So just the removal of trees. So why are they cutting down trees? There's a couple of reasons. Number one, they're eating the cambium, which is the green stuff underneath the bark. But those large trees that often fell because they're trying to stimulate the growth of faster growing vegetation. So willows and things like that. So they take that wood, often break it up, take the smaller limbs, and they'll build a dam out of that. And there's a few reasons why they build dams. So there's like 3 principal reasons. Number one is just for protection. So beavers are have virtually 0 predators in the water, but on land, they're considered the milk duds of the forest. So pretty much anything with sharp teeth will eat them. I think I read a study in Colorado, the diet of wolf populations in the winter was like 50% beaver. So they're a major food source for a lot of species on land, but in the water, they're totally safe. So beaver will build a dam. And so this is like a really big dam. So this might be their central dam. They'll build a dam for protection, but once they have a dam carved out, it's likely that they'll start building dams above and below. So if on the landscape, you start seeing additional dams being constructed in your jurisdictions, it's likely that these beavers are expanding their home territory. So the second reason is they need a food catch in the winter. So beavers do not hibernate, they're awake all winter long. So they'll take all the sticks that they can find, and they create a dam that creates a pond that's deep enough. And they create the dam by putting sticks they stick it into the mud like this, and then they'll go on the inside, the pond side of the dam, and scoop up mud, and they like scoop it up like this and grab it, and then swim to the dam and then kind of waddle up and pack the mud in there and make it. It's not watertight, but it's pretty bomb proof. So it's pretty deep in that area where they've been mining mud. So that is an area where they'll often start to cache their food, and they take sticks and they just wedge them down into the mud. And then that creates a food source for them in the wintertime. And the entrance to their lodge is somewhere over here. It's below the water, so they can just swim down, grab their sticks, pull them back up into their lodge, and then munch on them throughout the wintertime. So the third reason is beavers are actually farmers, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But what they're doing when they're building dams is they're raising up the water level and the groundwater level and starting to flood out vegetation on the periphery of the stream system. So you can see all these dead trees. This is not by accident, this is by design. They're purposely killing these trees and allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor and then stimulating that fast growth. So they're really interested in creating food for themselves in those areas. All right, a little bit about beaver life history. So in any colony that's actively reproducing, there's the two reproducing adults, the male and female. Then there's the yearlings, they're 1 to 2 years old. There's usually 2, maybe 3 of those. And then there's the young of the year, which we call kits. And so the kits kind of just float around and just be kits, be babies. The yearlings are beavers in training. And when they get to around 2 or maybe 3, they get booted out of the colony, and then they start to move over the landscape and look for places to build. So oftentimes you'll see in the spring, maybe early part of the summer, you might see beavers kind of poking around in new areas and creating dams. And sometimes you might be scratching your head and say, like, why is this beaver creating a dam in this specific spot? It's horrible. It's a horrible spot. These are, number one, teenage beavers, right? So they're making bad decisions pretty much all the time. But on top of that, they're experimenting. And what beavers do is they go into marginal habitat and try to improve it and make it much better. So they'll often find areas that are pretty inopportune for us, usually linear infrastructure that could cause major problems off roadside ditches. They'll build small dams in there, create a lot of headaches for people, and then eventually they just move on. But for that maybe year, or however long that they're sticking around, they can cause problems. Oh yes, and the lifespan. So typical lifespan is 10 to 15 years. Because they are a major food source for a lot of predators in areas with a high predator population, that the lifespan is likely lower. In areas around here, the suburban interface, they're probably doing pretty good. So it's possible that these guys are living towards the long end of their lifespan. Okay, so why are we really talking about beavers? We're number one, they're ridiculously cute. Actually, the adult beavers, when they get really big, they kind of get a little freaky. They have these really buggy eyes, but when they're kits, they're just unbelievably cute. But the real reasons are they do a lot for the landscape and create a lot of benefits. So number one, they restore and maintain riparian ecosystems. In doing so, they create lots of habitat for various species. And then they also create ecosystem benefits and potentially have the potential for climate change resilience. And I'll talk about all these just a little bit. Okay, so beavers are considered ecosystem engineers, which is a term that means beavers are doing a whole lot of work on the landscape that helps them, but it's also modifying the landscape in pretty substantial ways. So some of the things that they can do are, number one, promote aggregation. People looking to do restoration in really incised stream systems often will utilize beavers, and beavers will come in and build a dam. That dam starts to, you can see them here, right here. This is a really inside system. You can see this is where the floodplain is, and this is really cut down. They'll come in, they'll build dams, it slows the water down, and it starts to erode sediment, and that sediment builds up. And slowly but surely, the sediment builds and the stream might go around it, but beavers will continue to build with that change. And after a while, we can reconnect the stream system with the floodplain, which provides a whole bunch of other benefits on top of that. They also create a lot of messiness, a lot of complexity, and that complexity is really responsible for creating lots of different habitat conditions for species of all kinds. So that's huge. Increased heterogeneity is pretty much the same. Biogeochemistry, there's all these different areas of potential biogeochemical cycling. There's anaerobic conditions, there's mixed conditions, there's aerobic conditions. So there's lots of different ways that water quality is being impacted by beavers being present. So I mentioned beavers are doing a lot of good things for other species. They're considered a keystone species, pretty much the same kind of concept as ecosystem engineers. By building these dam systems, they create all these habitats for other species. And so when beavers become present in the system, we see biodiversity going up substantially. So you see an increased abundance of fish because it creates all these different little areas where invertebrates can carve out different life histories. When there are more fish, there's often fewer mosquitoes. So people kind of usually give me a weird look when I say that, but studies have shown fewer mosquitoes in beaver ponds, many more amphibians, no surprise, more ungulates because there's just more water along the periphery of stream systems to allow vegetation to pop up, so more forage, and then lots of different mammals utilize these areas for hunting and other purposes. There's been a bunch of different bird studies out there, and there's some surprising pretty eye-opening results. So in systems where we see beavers coming in, we see the habitat complexity going up substantially. And oftentimes with that habitat complexity, we see those dead trees that are those standing dead trees. They get first, they die, they become infested with insects. The woodpeckers come in, they start making holes, and that kicks off the beginning of cavity nesting and all sorts of different opportunities for birds. So this is kind of the big takeaway. So this study, recent 76, looked at 4 beaver ponds and found over 92 bird species in just those 4 ponds alone. So just like an explosion of biodiversity in those areas, which is pretty amazing. So oftentimes when talking about beavers with people, they'll ask about fish passage and fish passage constraints and whether beavers are causing problems or not. When people think that beavers are causing fish passage barriers, this is often what they see. They see a really big dam and fairly shallow water. It's unlikely that fish can jump over the dam at this location. But less commonly do people go out to these sites and see the stream system in the condition when fish are more commonly moving through these systems. So after a big storm system, or before a big storm system, fish are waiting up below the dam, just kind of holding. We get a big pulse of rain coming through the system, water levels go up, and then fish begin to move. And when water gets to a level like this, it's really easy for fish to make it to the system. It's also fairly common where there's beaver dams, water will come around on the periphery of the stream. And some fish species can either, if they're small enough, they can just swim right up those little rivulets. And then some, like out west, coho salmon love these type of streams, and they'll literally walk with their pectoral fins up, even if the water is this deep and they're like this tall, they can literally walk up those little rivulets. It's pretty crazy. And then a fish biologist was telling me that they were ripping down a beaver dam. I don't know why I was telling you this, but they were ripping down a beaver dam, and they actually found lots of fish that were wedged in the dam. So the dam is not watertight, it's fairly porous, and fish can actually squiggle in, and sometimes they'll just stay in the dam and just hang out. They'll hold there and then rest or whatever they're going to do, and then they'll move on from there. So there's a few different ways that fish can move through these systems. And we were working with a landowner who was really concerned with beavers being a fish passage barrier, so he removed his dam, and then we went out after he removed it, and he basically had dewatered the pond behind it and stranded all these different fish. So the proof is in the pudding. And then last but not least, I did a beaver relocation study out in Washington State in between 2014 and 2018. And we were monitoring all the sites with wildlife cameras to see what was going on. And we saw that there was this bobcat out kind of prowling around the beaver sites. And we were getting a little bit worried because we were thinking, okay, this bobcat might eat a beaver. And bobcat are not really that much bigger than beaver, but who the heck knows what's going to happen. So we're a little worried. It turns out that this bobcat was not interested in eating the beaver. It was using, it was using the beaver dam. Let me see if I can get it going. Here we go. It was using the beaver, sorry, this is bad, but the next little section you'll be able to see. It was using the beaver dam as a fishing location. And so there you go. So it had just caught a coho salmon right there. So pretty cool. Sorry, you can't see it very well with the lights on, but still pretty cool. Okay, so beyond the benefits that beavers provide for other species, other ecological benefits, beavers do a bunch of things or provide a bunch of benefits for ecosystem services and potential climate resilience. So some of those big ones are buffering peak storm events, trapping water higher up in the watershed and keeping it there for a longer period of time so it has opportunities to infiltrate into groundwater. And then in the winter, in the summertime, release some of that water out during really low flow conditions to help supplement base flow. Okay, so here's just a few examples of those things that I've mentioned from studies that I've done in the past. This was from a relocation study that I did, that same one I was talking about. And these 3 years were when beavers moved into the system. So this is the amount of water holding capacity in stream reaches after beaver moved in. And usually they were only there for just one season. So basically from we were looking here from like May through August. So within that short period of time, when these beavers moved into the system and started building dams, they increased the water holding capacity in reaches up to 22 times as much as what it was before beavers moved into those systems. These are mountainous reaches, so it's it's highly likely that when beavers move into more flat systems, that we're going to see a lot more holding capacity in those areas. Likewise, in that study, I was looking at groundwater and groundwater recharge, and this is where the real water is stored. So when you see the ponds, sometimes they're quite impressive. They can be really big, but really most of the water is being stored in the ground by elevating the water table. And so in those ponds that we were looking at, we saw about 2.5 times as much water storage in the groundwater as we saw in surface water areas. And then once again, so in mountainous areas, there's a limitation for how much groundwater or how much water table increase we can see because there's just mountain, more narrower valley walls. In flatter areas, we expect to see the amount of groundwater storage substantially higher. In terms of temperature effects, beavers can have different effects based on the morphology of the system. So in ponds like this that are kind of bathtub shaped, relatively flat, relatively shallow and wide, those systems tend to see increased temperatures because water is just sitting there and warming up. So same as wetland systems that act like this. In other systems, though, where there's a big enough dam and maybe some topography going on, we often see a cooling effect. And the mechanism for that is we have a pond here, a dam, and there's enough head or weight of the water that it starts to promote infiltration into the ground. And as that water infiltrates into the ground, the ambient ground temperature is the average temperature of wherever we are, wherever that latitude is. So maybe here it could be like 55 degrees or something around there. So if you have warm water infiltrates into the ground, it cools along with the ground, and then eventually it pops back up downstream, and then it will supplement the stream with cooler water in those locations. So this is a site where we were looking at beaver, the temperature effect of beaver in the pond system. This is a wetland, and so there's a stream coming down into this really impressive wetland complex. And then there's a beaver dam here, and that dam was enormous. It was like maybe 7 feet tall, or maybe even a little bit bigger. So really impressive dam. And then it went underneath the freeway and then out into this river system. So we had temperature loggers where all the green little dots are. So water coming into the stream system, so this is over the summertime, was around 57-ish degrees Fahrenheit. So not hot, not cold. And then it flowed into the wetland complex. And this was basically what I was talking about. A very shallow system, super wide, very little tree cover. And so within these two locations, water temperature was up to even over 75 degrees. So it's like bath water, basically. So we would expect that in this case, beavers are warming up the system. But what's happening is over in this area where the beaver pond is open, it was deep enough that there was a separation and a thermocline. And so the deep part of the pond was quite cold. The surface was warm, but all the water is coming out towards the bottom through that porosity of the dam. The water's coming out in the lower parts. And we saw, even though the water here was 75 degrees, the water coming out of the dam was freezing cold. So it was about 48 degrees. So there was a substantial cooling effect, even though that water had been sitting in the pond and warming up really to like alarming levels. So some pretty cool stuff. This is a figure from a study that was a meta-analysis looking at a whole bunch of beaver studies and assembling that information into one single set of metrics. And so they're looking at all different ways that beavers affect systems. And so this is, if things are falling over here, this is net positive. If things are falling over here, this is net negative. And in this case, negative and positive doesn't mean good and bad. It just means there's a positive effect or a negative effect. So we're looking at things like overall fish populations, amount of macroinvertebrates, ecosystem function, water storage, carbon storage, sediment storage, fine and coarse, the amount of water present. All those are increased, not super surprising based on what I mentioned. But nitrogen processing, positive and negative, same thing that we kind of see in wetland complexes. There is some degree of phytoremediation or plants sucking up nitrogen, but there's also nitrogen being released in those wetland systems as well. And then velocity, this is over on the negative side. That's no surprise. Beavers are building dams. They're slowing that water down substantially, and the water's going down. Temperature here, they're finding that the average temperature is slightly positive. So there's more warming than cooling, but that, like I mentioned, it's highly context specific based on the morphology of the system. So depending on where we are, we'll see different things happening there. Okay, beaver conflicts. So beavers are doing some great stuff on the landscape, but they're making more of themselves. And as they're moving into areas that are in close proximity with people, we're seeing lots of different things happening. So the main kind of classes of conflicts are beavers cutting trees down and creating problems for landowners with vegetation removal, backward watering, building dams at backwater culverts or otherwise interfere with culverts and water conveyance, plugging up culverts. This is really hard to deal with this when beavers plug up, especially corrugated culverts. It is really challenging to deal with that, and beavers know it and they love it, so they do it. And the flooding of road all types of property, and then beaver dams and narrow streams. This is one of the hardest things to deal with on an ongoing basis. Okay, so what are some of the management options? There's a whole slew of management options that you can utilize. I've highlighted the three that are the most common that people do. Number one is dam removal. I listed that as a short-term option because beavers can build a dam almost as fast as you can remove a dam. So I was working with a guy out in the country, and he had a roadside ditch, and then his house was below the road. So this beaver was coming in. I think it was a juvenile beaver. Came in and built a dam and was kind of flooding out the landowner. So every morning he would, you know, he's in a suit. Every morning he put on his galoshes, go out there with his rake and remove the dam. And then every night the beaver would build the dam back. And that went on for a year and a half. And then he called me and then we went out there and tried to figure it out. But dam removal is the solution, but it's usually a very temporary solution. Once in a while, you can persuade a juvenile beaver that's kind of just experimenting with the site to move on, but don't hold your breath. You probably won't happen. Lethal trapping, trap to remove and kill. That's an approach that many people have taken. One of the reasons that that's the go-to approach is because we have been doing that for a century or longer. And for a long time, that was an approach that worked because all these government agencies were also trapping and removing beavers. So the population was relatively low. If you remove the family, a colony, it was unlikely that another one would find it in short order. Now there's so many beavers that if you remove the colony, it's likely that other ones in the surrounding area will find that available habitat. So if you have available habitat, a species is going to find it. It's also hard to guarantee you have all the beavers in the colony. So you might get 6 beavers, there still might be 2 left. And so they'll come back and do that space. There's other options here as well, which we can't talk about, but we don't have enough time to go into everyone. The pond levelers are in my opinion, the most long-term sustainable benefit, meaning that putting in these devices allows you to reduce the conflict issue. The beavers get to stay there, so you're not removing the beavers just to find that you've found new beavers moving in that are more problematic than the last ones. So this tends to remove the problem, retain the ecological benefits, and then if you have landowners who are really opposed to trapping through lethal means, they're happy with that process. The people who don't care are still happy because the flooding issue is gone. But I had a different figure for you guys. Here's a figure of the leveler. Some of you might be utilizing this or are familiar with these. It's basically a dam. The dam is right here. It's a pipe that goes through the dam, and then there's a cage that goes on the front of the pipe. Beaver can feel the movement, sometimes hear the movement of the water coming in, so they'll try to plug it up, but if there's a cage around it, they'll avoid it. And it works 99% of the time. These things cost around $1,000. And so for a solution that continues for the life of the device, that's a pretty good deal. One thing is important to note though, so beaver need a minimum amount of water to feel safe. And if they don't have that, they won't feel safe and they'll go berserk. So if you keep the water about 2 feet or higher, beaver will be happy, the device will work, most likely forever. If you dewater it down to 18 inches, for example, the beaver just won't have enough water to do their thing. And they'll be like, this is not going to work. And they'll either build a dam right here, or they'll build a dam on top of this thing, which is crazy, but I've seen it. They'll build a bigger dam and they'll just do something. They'll just keep on messing around until they defeat you. And then it gets harder and harder after that. And so beavers learn really quickly. So if they can figure out how to beat you, they'll teach it to all of their relatives and they'll all beat you. It's super frustrating. All right. And so the reason I was mentioning this is because I think that the device is the best way to go. It's cost effective. It's long lasting, but these devices only work in deep enough water. So there are times when lethal removal is really your only option. Okay, so just kind of wrapping it up here. This is a study from the Virginia DOT from quite a while ago, but they were doing beaver management on their the roads that they maintain. Or at first they were just ripping out dams and kind of they just had two guys in a pickup truck going around and ripping out the dams over and over. The total cost of that per year was around $300K. They started to implement beaver devices in those same reaches, and it reduced the manpower and maintenance costs down to $44,000 per year in those same systems. So implementing those devices can lead to a substantial amount of savings over time. Okay, so in conclusion, beavers coming into systems, natural or urban systems, we're gonna always have conflicts. There's just no way to avoid it. Beavers modify the landscape, often in ways that we're not particularly fond of. So we're gonna have those issues. Finding ways to work with the beavers often results in longer lasting solutions that make pretty much everybody happy. Some systems really support beaver management, non-lethal beaver management forever. Other systems just don't. And then in those cases, you have to trap beavers out. Public sentiment is a huge driver of the actions that you take towards beaver. But from what I've seen, sentiment is continuously moving towards pro-beaver. For the landowners whose house is flooding out, or for the landowner who just had all their apple trees eaten by a beaver in one night, we're not going to have probably happy people. But for the general public, they're continuously advocating for non-lethal management. So the good news is that's out there. And then last but not least, I will leave you with beaver are coming whether you like it or not. So it's better to be thinking about how you'll react to it before they start causing major problems than after they start causing major problems. All right, and a little plug for all the people who helped with some of those studies that I showed. And with that, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to do some Q&A. So that is the question. So we always debate, are beavers consciously thinking about this, or is it all instinct? One time I saw in a lake system, this beaver family built a dam across the lake, and some were building the dam underwater, some were starting on either edge. And it just seemed like, how did they figure this out? Like, even if it is instinct, how did they put all of this together to build a super long dam through a lake system? So I have no idea, but I don't want to question. Yeah, nobody knows. Yeah.
Do we have any idea how sort of pervasive they are around this region now? I've never seen one.
I don't know. I know in the main stem of Neponset, I've seen a whole bunch of beaver sign. I moved out here in 2020, and I've seen continuous sign in the lower stretches. And then there's a hiking trail on Burma Road. You guys are familiar with that? I've seen a bunch of beaver sign up there too. And I've heard other people mentioning, I don't know, it's a lot of anecdotal, but I don't know the exact number, but I think there's a good number around. Yeah.
If necessary, how do you initiate a relocation of a beaver in a neighborhood? Who would you contact, and where would they be to, and what not?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So relocation is a really tricky job, and it's usually not a good conservation measure. It's better for academic studies, maybe once in a while for actual conflict removal. But the problem with relocation is that they're unlikely to stay where you put them. You have to do a lot to modify and kind of like improve the habitat before you relocate a beaver to the relocation spot. And so even if you do everything right, the chances of them staying where you put them is about 50%. So if you relocate them, chances are they're just going to move like right next to where you put them, but wherever like another landowner is, that you're going to drive crazy in the process. And then the other thing is if you don't have a good sense of what the beaver population is, if you put a beaver in a spot with other beavers, they're highly territorial. So they put a lot of effort into creating their dam, creating a lodge, building secondary dams. So they will fight and kill other beavers in those areas. So it's likely that if you relocate a beaver, you're probably giving it a death sentence. So it's better to just lethally remove the beaver instead of relocating it. There's also probably permit issues. I'm not familiar with what those are in Massachusetts, but those can be pretty challenging, especially when an agency is going to give you permission to relocate a beaver. Then the onus falls on them if that turns into a major conflict issue. So they're pretty averse to approving it unless you're going to put it like in a national forest or some sort of state sanctuary that's big enough that it's not going to create conflict in the surrounding area.
I understand was that relocation is legal.
Is it legal?
It is legal.
Illegal?
Yeah, it is
Okay.
illegal.
Yeah.
And for the reasons that you just stated, cannot relocate an animal, it's either lethal or not.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So out in Washington, I knew a couple of trappers. Well, a couple trappers told landowners that they were relocating them, but they were relocating to beaver heaven. And then a couple trappers were actively relocating to just random spots. I don't know if they were just, making future jobs for themselves in the case. But so I think people are doing it, but I don't know what the
Yeah,
outcome is.
they have all kinds of animals. I actually studied this in graduate school and did a, paper on it. They're every animal, birds, lizards, mammals, they all come back to get the direction of where they work for, or like you're saying, it's like dropping a human in New York City with no resources, no family, and saying, here you go, this is human habitat, and they're just gonna get killed or what have you. So it doesn't work. So that's why it's so.
Yeah, one interesting thing about beavers is they have, they're really sensitive and they have, they get an ulcer really easily when they're stressed out. And then when that happens, if they are carrying any sort of parasitic load or anything, then their immune system pretty much shuts down and then they just get sick really fast. And we've actually seen that with relocating beavers. So you have to be really careful when relocating it. Get stressed out and die. It's an evolutionary process. So if you're getting a call from a landowner that there's a problem, chances are that beaver's been there for a season and they have a whole lot more set up than you're hoping. But if you're watching them build, they'll start with a main dam. They'll let that, create a pond. And then as the pond creates itself and kind of like tendrils out into the landscape, they'll evaluate that and then they'll start probably building a dam above that and then a dam below that. And they'll just keep on leapfrogging back and forth until they have this long stretch. And that allows them to just be in anywhere in that system, usually like maybe a quarter mile, or maybe a little bit smaller than that. But it just gives them a lot of freedom of movement. And some of those dams potentially slow down high volume water or high velocity water. So it protects the main dam. So it's hard to say, and it's always kind of, sometimes they'll build that main dam and then they'll move to another area once they've started to really change the system. So it's kind of just, it just moves with it. And that's one of the cool things about managing beaver. You get to actually see that, and then you have to kind of think about the landscape, think about what the beavers are doing and what they might do, and then you react to that, and then they react to you, and it just goes back and forth. So it's a really kind of a cool way to interact with a species that you can't really do with any other animal type.
How heavy of a log can they move?
Say that again?
How heavy of a log can they move? Like,
Oh, how heavy of a log? So I have a whole bunch of. Oh, here we go. One cool thing is this stuff from my beaver nature talk. So when the structure of beaver is really kind of crazy. They have all these adaptations which make them really just suited for what they do, but the musculature and the bone structure on the back end of beavers is just huge, and it's designed to let them grab a log and pull it. So I don't know an exact weight, but they can move surprisingly large logs.
What draws them to culverts?
To culverts? Well, so, yeah, that's a good question. What's that? Moving water? Yeah, exactly. So I like to say, basically, beavers will go to a culvert and look at it and be like, these humans are awesome. They built this amazing dam, totally waterproof. They just forgot about this one little hole. I'll just plug it up for them. And so they get in there and then it's game over. And so, like I said, with the corrugated culverts, they can really wedge sticks in there, and then it's really challenging. I worked for a county government, and our maintenance guys came out to one of the sites like that, and they actually had to get a machine that they grabbed a telephone pole and they banged it through the culvert and popped the dam out because there's just no other way to do it. I think that was totally like a no-no with OSHA, but they were just like, whatever. Yeah, so the guidance is in areas where there's gonna be a lot of beaver activity to replace or just not put in culverts that are corrugated and use either like a bottomless arch that has straight walls or a straight wall concrete rectangular culvert. Those are usually much better and they don't get plugged out.
Why beavers are so important, I would like yourself that you study all of that, what is it?
So all those habitat benefits that they create. And so it's not just at the local level. So when you have enough beavers at the landscape level, they can have meaningful effects that literally will offset some climate impacts that we're expecting to see. So, yeah, it's not just even like that local level that we're seeing, it's local ecosystem level and then landscape level. It's pretty impressive.
Any other questions for Ben?
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
So can I just ask, how many sea beavers as a substantial problem